So we're picking up where we left off in the previous video, talking about the Turkey South and the question of difference, outward difference versus inner differences, similarities.
Yeah. And the question being here, now that sort of there is historical research, there's a basic understanding of what Enlightenment philosophy sort of endeavors for, what emancipation policies are after, the question of how the communities within this broader imperial project experience these top-down driven social changes. Mm-hmm. And one way, and so we spoke about Rabbi Nachman's experience of it, insight into how to deal with it. Mm-hmm. But moving forward from the turn of the 18th century, we come to a time when certain, let's call them minority groups, very successfully dissolve their visible differences. Minority might not technically be the right term. A historian friend of mine, a historian of political thought, once told me that technically there are no minorities in empires. Minorities are a phenomenon of nation states. Empires have marginal groups, not minor groups. Because there's no majority in the empire. That's precisely the point. It's a kind of relative norm to which any and all are expected to adhere in order to fit in. But so we come to certain smaller groups contained within imperial projects very successfully dissolving their visible differences. And about 100 years down the line, different countries or different contexts are responding to the successful dissolution of these differences from a visible perspective, from the public sphere perspective, responding to it in different ways. And one of the main moments where this project of emancipation begins to implode is with the idea, which was there, it was there all along, but it never grabs center stage, which is that having an invisible difference actually implies that you may have two allegiances. You may have two loyalties. By making your difference invisible, you have demonstrated a loyalty to your country's, nation's, empire's political project. But by merely making the difference invisible rather than doing away with it entirely, you have also attested to the fact that you maintain a parallel allegiance to some other group. Not surprisingly, Rabbi Nachman is a Hasidic rabbi living during a period in which the Russian Empire is very anxious about new clandestine associations such as the Freemasons forming in their territories and elsewhere in the world. I mean, to this day we have popular trash films about the role of Freemasons in the establishment of the United States. Right? So there's the idea that invisible differences are still a political position to be taken. That is, making your difference invisible, learning to live with being a Turkey, is also a political statement, and it is not a political statement that accords entirely with the political project of the state or empire in which you're living. Now, it doesn't accord with it because it's impossible to perfectly accord with it unless the state is going to clearly identify the model that everyone must copy, which is the case with the Inquisition, right, and medieval societies, but not modern societies. So that is structurally built into the idea of a free and emancipated society is the impossibility of ever perfectly and fully fitting into a free and emancipated society, no matter who you are. And so maintaining difference becomes a sort of political pushback, advertently or inadvertently, against emancipatory thinking. And this fact hits center stage on a global level with the Dreyfus affair, with the trial of Alfred Dreyfus, a Jew, Frenchman, captain in the French military, right, who's accused of treason. Why is he a traitor? Because he is not fully 100% loyal to France. He has another loyalty he maintains. Now, the loyalty he maintains is to the fact that he perceives himself, right, that he thinks of himself as a Jew, which for French chauvinist nationalists is equal to being German. That's a different issue. I don't really want to get into why a Jew and a German are the same from the French perspective, but the point is to say that his maintenance of this invisible difference is a political threat or pushback to the kind of norm, or at least those that in the name of some romantic chauvinist nationalism would imagine there to be a stable, coherent norm against which compliance and difference, invisible or not, can be measured. Which certainly seems not to be the case. But so Dreyfus is tried as a traitor. The trial goes on for many, many years. He's found guilty, and then he's tried again and again, ultimately exonerated, but after a long affair of being found guilty. And this, Wikipedia is a great source to read about all these kinds of individual historical moments. I won't spoil the ending for you. You can read what happens on the Wikipedia page. But the point is that the existence of invisible differences has become a source of anxiety. And similarly so in Nazi Germany, where the invisibility, right, of Jews among Germans is a great source of anxiety. Now, in some countries, all that would suffice is to pledge allegiance to the country. And in other countries, nothing can undo your being a Turkey. In other words, that is, your Turkeyness has now taken a step forward. It's the response of the political order saying, your being a Turkey is not only because you continue to believe you're a Turkey, we maintain that you're a Turkey as well. And so the question is it possible to stop being a Turkey? Right? And some countries will say, yes, you pledge allegiance to normalcy or French nationalism or whatever, and you may be able to leave your Turkeyness behind. And some political projects such as Germany, right, the German state at the time, says, no, you're always going to be a Turkey. That is, invisible differences are not non-differences. It's a real difference, right? It has, for them, it's both invisible and ontologically fully present, real in their society at the same time, which is a very fertile bed for conspiracy theories, such as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and other thoughts that a kind of Jewish global banking network, right, is behind capitalism, etc., etc. What's interesting is that this kind of response rises in Russia, in Germany, in France, and even the United States, all at the same time. And the Russians are saying the Jews are the Bolsheviks, and then the Bolsheviks are saying the Jews are the capitalists, and the Germans are saying the Jews are the communists, or the Jews are the intellectuals. So it's not about Jews. It's about this image, this figure of one who maintains an invisible difference from society. And how do you deal with that? But that is what underlies one of the basic notions of treason in the 20th centuries, maintaining an alternate parallel allegiance, right? Not fully committing and being loyal to your society, but also to another group that is infra-political. That is, it's below the surface of the visible polity. The fact that it is infra, that it is below the surface, is part of the superstructure that maintains the visible homogeneity of your polity. And at the same time, these groups go beyond. They're external to the polity in the sense that groups such as Jews are infra in every state and are connected beyond the limits of that divide state from state. This is similar to the Freemasons, certainly, right? I would say it's an entirely different conversation to have to what extent these categories can be applied to groups whose visible difference cannot be erased, such as black people, right? Africans forcibly brought as slave labor to North America, and who to this day continue to suffer from certain inequalities, part of which is determined by this impossibility of erasing visible differences, and this impossibility is something seized on by the state. And here we see an example, right? This is not, no one would call it treason unless you happen to be a football player kneeling, right? No one would call this treason, but they will say the fact that this difference from the normal continues is a sign that you are not 100% loyal to our norm, right? Whereas if you can make your difference invisible, appear to be normal and yet continue outside, infra-politically, right, to operate vis-a-vis the norm, that's even more anxiety-producing. That's even more threatening. And this is where you get the kind of global conspiracy theories. I saw a nice little skit. I wish I could give a shout out. I don't remember who it was. I believe it was on I Love You America. The interviewee was saying it used to be called the Jewish media and the Jewish global banking conspiracy, and now it's called the liberal media, right? And nowadays it's called global oligarchy, right? So we've sort of I don't know what to call it. We've washed clean. I wouldn't say whitewashed, pink-washed, brown-washed. I would say invisible-washed, right? That is, we've invisible-washed these conspiracy theories so they can apply generically to any group that we suspect is living among us but not fully loyal to the us in question.
So on this point, this is really fascinating stuff, and thank you so much for this. I'm also related to all of this. I wonder, every group. It seems to me I haven't, been part of every group, obviously, but my senses have been part of different groups over the years. Every group seems to like to have a bit of a conspiracy theory vis-a-vis the other, whoever that perceived other is. What do you think's going on there? I mean,
yeah, that's a good question. So firstly, I'll say, if you notice, conspiracy theory is a fairly broad term, right? And the conspiracy theory vis-a-vis groups such as blacks who are not able to become invisible in a sort of white normative society are not as deep running as conspiracies against groups such as Jews who are successfully able to become invisible. Because the kind of conspiracies you have against African Americans is Medicare fraud, right? Social Security fraud. It's a conspiracy theory. It's unfounded statements about taking advantage of the system. And it's a kind of conspiracy implying that this group is conspiring to sort of take advantage unfairly of certain social welfare structures that we have. That's a conspiracy theory, but it's also a fairly visible conspiracy. That is, you can see it happening or not happening. It implies an direct engagement with the political system in a way that you may discover, right, Social Security fraud. Whereas conspiracies of a kind of secret global banking network, right, or global oligarchy, is a much harder conspiracy to put your finger on and pin down. Right? And in that, it becomes a much more dangerous but also useful tool for populists to wield.
It's not unlike, in some ways, the idea of this global threat of terror that Muslims present, because it's this. I mean, how does one identify such an abstract notion?
Right. So there's global terrorism, right? And anyone could be a member. And I think this is an interesting. This is a very interesting example. Terrorism specifically, our experience of a global threat of terrorism, in the limits or the sort of the overlap between these two groups that I'm artificially parsing out, those that can become invisible and those that cannot become invisible. Because if you think about it, until about the year 2000, Muslims were white. That is, they were in the U.S. They were white, right? They were no different from someone with an Italian or Mediterranean look. They spoke English. They were integrated. They were not black. They were not Asian, right? They were not Mexican, Latino. They were not marked in that way as particularly different from the norm, and fairly well integrated in that sense as well. And over the past 15 years or so, maybe 20 years, right? There's been a massive global media push by many forces. I'm not I don't want to go in. I don't think I'm qualified to go into, which channels and which reporters and which forces or funding forces are pushing which agenda. But over the past 20 years, I think we've gotten to the point that very slowly but very stubbornly, the perspective, our perception of the difference that Islam maintains, that Muslims maintain from the normative West, has gone from an invisible difference to a visible difference. A very interesting process. That is, they've been marked and remarked to the point that now we've learned, that is, the public media, film, television, news reports, etc., have trained us to see that difference. Which I think for me, on a theoretical level, implies that invisible differences are only invisible vis-a-vis the epistemology you occupy. And that can be changed. And here, of course, I'm also drawing on the thought of Rancière, divisions of the perceptible, and one can be trained to see differences that one was not used to thinking of as different previously. And we've been trained now to see this. So it was a long process of training, and what this implies for me, though, if I may be a little hopeful, is that the process is possible in the opposite direction as well. That is, perhaps it's possible to train ourselves not to see a difference between black and white.
Oh, I believe that.
Right? I mean, that's a real epistemological possibility. The question is how to bring that about, and unfortunately it seems easier to push people out of the norm than it is to include them in the norm.
Well, I think that's a powerful point. I wonder if, I mean, I can't help, I mean, I'm biased, of course, towards education, but it has to be a different kind of education, because the educational models that we have today are what have got us to where we are, despite all the efforts of liberal institutions like Columbia and what have you. I mean, it's still business as usual, and if anything, it's worse than normal. And I mean, I certainly take, I take pages out of Foucault in terms of his notion of technologies of the self. I think I'm convinced that the changes that we seek to effect on the sort of psychic level cannot be done through just discourse. Is very important. That's a very significant aspect of learning, but we have to rediscover en masse. I think, and this is one of the problems with Protestant Christianity, is that the traditional technologies of the self, which were necessary to create holistic human beings, are no longer there. So we have to, Judaism has this, Islam has this, Orthodox Christianity, Buddhism, etc., etc. And somehow these differences, I think, this is my intuition, can be...
Absolutely. I think one lesson that I draw from Rabbi Nachman's writings is that this is never a process that's done vis-a-vis the political power. It's done either internally or between the invisible groups. Because if you imagine the Turkey Prince wandering the world, right? My question now is, does the Turkey Prince have the ability to spot other people who believe they're a turkey, even though they're dressed normally? Right? Does he have that ability? Because if he had that ability, that would entirely circumvent, right, or undercut, right, in an infra-political sense, right, the politics of the state, and allow for a kind of making invisible or making unimportant the visibility and invisibility of difference among the smaller groups, which reminds me of another story Rabbi Nachman told. Another short parable. Once there was a king who would gaze into the stars and foretell the future. One day he summons his viceroy and closest advisor and says to him, I have an urgent matter to discuss with you. Last night when I gazed at the heavens, I saw in the stars that this year's crops, whoever eats from it will go mad. You see how Rabbi Nachman loves this madness as a symbol, right?
That,
Anyone who eats from this year's crops will go mad. What should we do? And so the viceroy says, well, I mean, certainly we have to stockpile food for ourselves so that we won't have to eat from the maddening wheat. And the king says to the viceroy, that's impossible. If we are the only ones who do not eat the wheat, and everyone else eats the crops and goes crazy, then we will be the madmen for not being crazy like everyone else. No, certainly we have to eat from the maddening wheat. But this is what we should do. Let us make a sign on our foreheads so that after we eat from the wheat, we may still recognize each other as being mad. And this is a very interesting story also, again, in the context of late 18th century emancipation, but also in the way that it is more future-oriented than the previous example I brought. That is, the past is the stargazing premonition, the present is the king's conversation with the viceroy, and the future is everyone going mad. The viceroy doesn't see the future. He only sees the past and the present. And so, if you imagine what Marie Antoinette's answer would be, let them eat cake, right? He doesn't even have that notion of let them eat maddening wheat, because he doesn't see there is any future and any them. The king recognizes that there's a past, present, and future to the tale, and there are also three characters in the tale. There's the king, the viceroy, and everyone as a character. And this is in fact a tale about the emergence of everyone as the main character of a tale. Because once everyone goes mad, that character will be the character that sets the norms to which the king and the viceroy now have to comply, with which they have to comply. And so the king sees this and understands how the narrative is changing, right? And there's no foretellable future to this tale. He has to eat the maddening crops and go mad with everyone else. But he does have the understanding that with some preparation, right, it is possible to ensure that even once everyone is mad, you can still identify other madmen around you. And he says, let's make a mark on our forehead. It's a minimum, right? It's a kind of minimal signification that shows difference nonetheless. Even if, as I presume, trying to enter the world of this tale, the king has no reason to believe that after going mad, he will have any recollection of where this sign on the forehead came from, what it means, why he has it and others don't, nothing. But it will nonetheless be a minimal material signifier of a difference to which he must then attach himself and explore. And in that sense, right, if you think of the post-madness world and the king within the post-madness world, right, I would say, comparing it to the previous story, there's no way to know if the Turkey prince, right, is a human prince who starts the story under the table, having gone mad and believing he's a turkey, or if he's the king that refused to eat from the maddening wheat and is the only turkey left in a kingdom full of turkeys who now believe they're human and don't understand why he's not cooperating with their madness.
Well, this is fascinating that last gloss you gave to the story, because part of Foucault's point with Madness and Civilization is that the madmen and in days past, in pre-modern times, were the seers and the sages, right? So you had the fool, as a very common trope in literature, in Shakespeare, who's someone who sees through all the bullshit and says, this is what's going on. The emperor has no clothes. I'm sort of mixing tales here, but he calls it out. And so the madman, I'm very interested. I have deep fascination with madness as such, and to what extent it society needs to normalize for the sake of functioning. And Foucault has his own analysis, of course, with the Age of Reason. It had to create unreason and the other, and these are very fascinating tropes and themes that continue till now. And I wonder, and my intuition with regards to a previous question that you posed, that whether those who maintain certain differences below the surface, subterranean, or what have you, differences which are important to them, whether despite the outward similarities, if they can recognize other people, if the turkey can recognize other turkeys. And I think this is a very interesting question, and it raises question marks then vis-a-vis these minority groups, shall we say, and again their loyalties or lack thereof to the wider state in question, as far as the dominant group narrative is concerned. And so if again my intuition is that the groups of turkeys have a sense that there is something that connects us, and we can identify them, and this is what gives us a sense of community, a sense of connection and love and shared values and so forth.
So reading these two stories together, right, and wondering if the normal king surrounded by madmen or the mad prince surrounded by normal humans, right, can be distinguished from each other. I think the sign on the forehead suggestion would imply that the question of whether turkeys can identify other turkeys is a very simple question to answer. Absolutely, because everyone around you is a turkey. That's the takeaway.
Right.
Everyone around you is a turkey. And so you don't have to look far to identify other turkeys. They're everywhere. But there's one group, right? There's one group. You use the term dominant culture, right? I would say there's one group of turkeys who insist that they are not and never were turkeys, right? Who insist that within their dominant culture, they have no problem of invisible difference because they are not in fact different from themselves. They're not different from the culture they occupy. We think of this sometimes as dominant culture. In the United States, I think in recent years we've been witnessing the emergence of this group, right, claiming to be sort of a pro-white, right? And I'm not saying, I don't want to use terms like racist or any other further to the right hot button topics or terms, but just to say that the group that steps forward, right, that says things like Jews will not replace us, they clearly must be imagining that they have no invisible difference. They maintain no invisible difference from the norm. And I think that is a deeply misguided assumption. Because if appreciating invisible differences teaches us anything, it's that they are invisible, sometimes even to yourself. And that every group, whether they're a group or individuals with nothing in common, everyone in this post-emancipation, right, post-madness society maintains some invisible difference from a norm that can never fully be fulfilled. So in that sense, absolutely the people marching in Charlottesville, for example, right, are people that I would say to them, you too are a group that maintains invisible differences from the norm, because there's no other way to exist vis-a-vis this norm other than to maintain invisible differences. And in that sense, right, this is, if we said, is there any hope for spotting other turkeys? Yes, I think that among those groups who are aware that they maintain, those individuals or those groups who are aware that they maintain invisible differences from society, they have already the ability to identify each other as turkeys because they know that's what we're all going through. It's only those who refuse to acknowledge that or don't see that they too maintain such a difference that cannot be sort of engaged in conversation about this topic yet. But this is certainly an epistemological shift that could take place. That is, to demonstrate, to develop an epistemology, right, an ability to perceive these invisible differences in everyone, no matter how firmly they argue that they maintain no invisible difference from the norm, right? And in that sense, right, groups that are aware of this difference already are one or two steps ahead in this process, in this possibility, than groups who don't see these differences in themselves, right? And so to come together, right, groups that are aware of this, Muslims, blacks, Latinos, Christians, right, to bring them to come together and to say, well, we know that we have these differences. We recognize that we are turkeys, right? We can work together, right, to develop, not to make everyone the same turkey, but to develop a kind of turkey sense of self, right? That is to say, to develop a sense of belonging that is predicated on sharing the challenge of maintaining this invisible difference to the imagined sort of homogenous public. And in that sense, I think that is deeply challenging and undermining, right, to a group that not only believes they maintain no such difference, but are also the ruling power at the same time. And this is where I think the category of treason comes in. Because if we said, if the treason that Dreyfus was accused of was of purportedly fully committing his loyalty to France, but secretly, right, maintaining a difference from it. In some readings, Dreyfus himself is not aware of this difference. He claims there's no such difference, or that it doesn't matter, because he's 100% French loyal, and it is the outside perspective that says to him, you can't ignore this difference.
And we have to take his personal account seriously here, otherwise we run into all sorts of problems. Right?
Certainly.
If someone is claiming this to be the case, then...
Right. And so accusing him of ignoring this difference, right? Saying ignoring this difference is part of the epistemology of treason. Well, we can turn that around and say to all those people today who believe there's no difference between themselves and the norm, ignoring that difference is part of an epistemology of treason.
Okay, this is fascinating. Can you unpack
That's
that a little bit for us? Yeah.
If everyone, if this is as I'm saying, I mean, this is sort of I'm pushing a kind of social theory, but if everyone is somehow different from the norm, we see this because everyone wants to be different. And even people who you think are normative want to be different.
Right. And the norm again is historically a sort of abstract mode of being which has been set for us, by the powers that be for various reasons, for political control and for economic economically practical reasons and so forth.
Well, it starts by just making everyone look the same, and in early days, the same as the ruling power.
Right.
But what I think we can take from Rabbi Nachman's insights and moving forward to today is that the invisibility has taken over as the defining characteristic. And so the norm is to not show your differences.
Right.
That's the only norm to conform to. And so many groups, say, okay, I believe I'm different. I believe I'm different. And I should not be showing my difference. That's my way of sort of assimilating into society. I have a small token, to mark that there is difference nonetheless. I have it right there. Right? Others